This Week in Richmond is made possible in part by Dignity Memorial, caring for our communities with a network of funeral homes and cemeteries in Virginia and throughout North America. More information about Dignity Memorial's providers is online at dignitymemorial.com. Alpha Natural Resources, an energy company dedicated to respecting the land. Alpha Natural Resources, we power the world through the energy of our people. Haley Buick GMC, the place for a new Verano or Terrain Denali, in Richmond and online at haleybuickgmc.com. Everywhere there are lighting poles, there's one more opportunity to save money. Intelligent Illuminations provides cost-effective wireless lighting solutions for roadway or area outdoor lights. Kanawha Valley Arena, Virginia's cowboy town, hosting an array of events from Civil War reenactments to diesel truck pulls. More information online at virginiarodeo.com. The Virginia Chamber of Commerce, the voice of the Virginia business community, working in legislative, regulatory, and political arenas to promote the free enterprise system. So what do you do? Information about getting involved in advanced technology careers, making everything from clean energy to life-saving medicine, is available at dreamitdoitvirginia.com. Additional support is provided by these sponsors. And by the members of Virginia's public television stations. Thank you.
Welcome to This Week in Richmond, and a very welcome back to this trio of experts around Capitol Square and throughout Virginia. Really appreciate you all coming on This Week in Richmond and giving our viewers a taste of what's ahead in the upcoming session of the General Assembly, how you're seeing things with the transition and so forth. Chelyen Davis from the Fredericksburg Freelance-Star, Julian Walker, Virginian-Pilot, Jeff Schapiro, Richmond Times-Dispatch. So why don't we just start with you with anything you'd like to say about now. We're having, tell our viewers we're having the conversation on Monday. Session will have convened for a couple of days before they're seeing this program. Some of them may even see it after the inauguration day. But we're talking on Monday, so what words of wisdom would you like to start us off with?
I don't know about words of wisdom. I mean, we're all just sort of reading bills as they're coming in. I think we're seeing a lot on mental health issues. We're seeing a lot on ethics. Whether those bills get a lot of traction remains to be seen. You know, and we're all waiting to sort of see what happens with the incoming governor, you know, Terry McAuliffe, once he gets on the ground and gets inaugurated on Saturday and starts putting out some legislative proposals. I think we're all waiting to see what happens with that.
Thank you. Julian, start us off with some of your comments, please, sir.
Well, I think Chelyen hit on some of the high notes in terms of the policy issues, Medicaid expansion being the other one. I think as far as politics goes, the things to watch for are the two upcoming special elections. One that is going to be on Tuesday, January the 7th, that is down in the Norfolk area, and the other one later this month on January 21st up in Northern Virginia. Both of those are seats that are being vacated by two men who are now senators, Ralph Northam and Mark Herring, who won November elections to be statewide officers, Lieutenant Governor and Attorney General. And those the outcomes of those contests will go a long way in determining whether or not you're going to have Democrat control of the Senate or whether Republicans will retain their control of the Senate. And I think, as Jeff has written or foreshadowed in one of his columns, you could see some fireworks late in January as a result of that, if that happens. If Democrats win both of those seats, you have a 2020 Senate with Ralph Northam as a Democrat Lieutenant Governor. You could see some fights over and remaking of the committees, perhaps changing of the rules.
Well, perhaps. I don't know that the rules exist within either caucus. I'm certain they don't exist within either caucus to forcibly remove senators from committees. There might be a way to shift things around a bit in terms of the chairmanships, maybe a bit on procedure. But before we get to the Senate and the new governor, let's not forget the old one. You know, Bob McDonnell has yet to bid Virginia adieu, and he is leaving office under a cloud. And how he addresses that issue in his farewell to the legislature and the people of Virginia, I think will be very telling. It's entirely possible that this governor could be under indictment in short order. At least this is what we've been led to believe. It's also possible that a former governor may not be as attractive a pelt, if you will, to federal prosecutors, and that may inure to his benefit. Regardless, his conduct and the many, many months of scrutiny that this governor and his family have endured is going to guide the trajectory of this General Assembly. And as Chelyen correctly points out, legislators are very good about talking about tidying their nests. They're usually not particularly good at it. The last time there was any ethics reform of consequence was about 20 years ago. It's a sticky issue. It calls attention to the odd nature of the Virginia General Assembly. Ours is a citizen legislature. These are part-timers. They allegedly have jobs off season, and they don't want to do anything that discourages the electorate any more than it already has been by all this untoward news about Giftgate. But on the other hand, I don't think any of these legislators want to preempt any of their opportunities personally or professionally.
By the time our viewers are seeing the program, they will have entered a time in which they cannot raise money for state elections. But interesting thing I'm hearing in the news is that if one chooses to be running for a federal election, even a sitting member of the House or the Senate, you could be raising money for a federal PAC during the legislative process. So that's a minor thing, but something that some of them may wish to address.
Not so minor in that at stake is a Northern Virginia congressional seat that's been held by Republicans for over 30 years and is now considered to be fairly competitive, a possible pickup for the Democrats. Maybe more of a possibility if the Republicans have a good old-fashioned knockdown, dragged out fight for their nomination.
Speaking of which, what are your thoughts, again, because it's January 21st before it would occur, it looks like a three-way race shaping up in Northern Virginia for the seat vacated by Mark Herring, a Republican, another Republican running, Joe May, running as an independent, and then a Democrat. Is that an interesting dynamic that none of you report for media in Northern Virginia, but you are interested in the statewide politics?
Well, I think that what you're seeing there is the same sort of divisions within the Republican Party that have been in some of the other races that were shown between the Bowling and Cuccinelli race last year, or I guess going back before that since Bowling dropped out. But I think that if I read correctly, that Joe May decided not to try to get the Republican nomination when they decided to do it through a convention because he thought that he would not prevail or not do as well perhaps over some of the or over the conservative candidate with conservative Republicans who tend to go to conventions. So I think it's an interesting race to see how that plays out. I don't know that district as well since, as you say, I don't cover it. So I'm just sort of watching to see what happens.
And to Chelyen's point, I think it's interesting, we did a little item not too long ago about a retiring member of the legislature, Bob Perkey from Virginia Beach, kind of a long time, perhaps, establishment, I don't know if that's a pejorative or not within the party, but establishment Republican who is this evening, in fact, on Monday, January 6th, hosting a fundraiser in Richmond for Joe May, and he sent out a very kind of testimonial, laudatory email encouraging people to support Joe May and saying, Joe May is an independent because the Republican Party left him. So I think to Chelyen's point, it really is a microcosm of some of those kind of conflicts and divisions that exist within the Republican Party writ large. And beyond that, going back to the point about convention versus primary for a nominating method, one of the reasons that you're seeing perhaps the field being cleared in the U.S. Senate race for Ed Gillespie is that some of the people that might otherwise consider throwing their hat into the ring for the nomination to challenge Mark Warner for U.S. Senate is that there are folks who voted for last year's transportation package, and they are mindful of the fact that if you run for a nomination in a party convention where there is a more conservative list of attendees, you might have trouble as someone perceived as raising taxes, which is anathema to the fiscal conservative wing of the Republican Party.
Wasn't that why Joe May lost the House of Delegates primary back last fall anyway, against what was perceived to be a more conservative member of his own party, and partly because of Joe's involvement with the transportation bill? It's a long time ago. I don't remember all the details, but I think that's what was happening.
Well, that's,
yeah.
I mean, it depends on who you listen to. I mean, there are those who would argue that Bev Sherwood and Joe May lost their nomination contest because of that, although Speaker Bill Howell would tell you that's not the reason. And as we all remember, he famously promised no one in his caucus that voted for that transportation package would fail to be reelected, which in the case of two of his members, that did turn out to be the case.
That transportation bill, that's $6 billion in new taxes. Bob McDonnell, its primary author, to win its enactment, had to retreat on his no new taxes pledge. That, of course, is something that is causing some grief for him still in Republican circles. But this is not a package that was, passed with overwhelming Republican support. It was Democrats who provided the deciding votes, and they did it by exacting a pledge from the Republican regime to consent to some type of template. It's all fairly tentative, to the expansion of Medicaid to bring perhaps up to 400,000 uninsured Virginians under Obamacare. And this issue is landing in the laps of this new General Assembly. The new governor is committed to this. The business community is committed to it, saying that if we've got the federal government paying all these bills, that makes sense. But we have this Republican caucus in the House that is trying to figure out how to deal with the issue. And over the weekend, the speaker wrote a piece, or a piece was written for him. His byline was affixed to it in your paper, Chelyen, in which Bill Howell basically said, no way to Medicaid expansion. I don't know that that is necessarily an ironclad promise, particularly if Bill Howell can get something in return for it from the new governor. Maybe some type of a tax cut. One has heard a lot of talk about that from both parties.
And to that point, one of the rumors that's floating around the hallways, I'm sure you've heard this and you as well, both Terry McAuliffe and Ken Cuccinelli talked about BPOL, the Business Professional License Tax Relief. They talked about machine and tools and merchants capital. And one of the rumors that's floating around is perhaps there's a nexus between BPOL tax relief and Medicaid expansion when you factor in the level that the BPOL tax threshold that would kick in versus people that are either small business owners that would face the employer mandate penalty, or individuals who would face the individual penalty for not carrying health insurance under the Federal Health Care Act. So there's talk of that. The problem with that is it gets you into a whole bunch of accounting questions about how do you make localities whole because they rely on that money. Mm-hmm. Does that mean you relieve localities of a mandate to make up the difference? Does that mean that you get yourself into a car tax situation where the state is cutting a check every year to localities? I mean, there are a lot of moving pieces here, but that kind of conversation is floating around the hallways.
Well, but Bill Howell doesn't need Terry McAuliffe to give him a BPOL tax cut. Mark Cole has proposed a BPOL tax elimination almost every year, and it dies in the Republican House committees. So, I mean, it's been proposed a lot. I'm just saying they've killed it themselves.
Mm-hmm. Something else that was in the news over the weekend pertains to the governor-elect. As we're having the conversation, he's still governor-elect, being able or not able to send budget amendments. And some reference to the fact that this has happened before, did 4 years ago. Is this small matter that goes off the news, off the front page very quickly, or is it a matter that of foretelling some tension between, additional tension between, particularly the House leadership and the new administration?
The new administration is an administration comprised almost entirely of neophytes, from the governor on down. There's certainly members of the cabinet who've been appointed, or nominated rather, who are familiar with the process. There are agency heads who've yet to be named. There's a whole legislative lobbying staff that is not fully in place. Yes, this was the practice beginning 4 years ago when Bob McDonnell took office, looking to a Republican-dominated legislature, but a Republican governor familiar with the legislative process. So this was not necessarily an obstacle for him. I suspect, though it is largely procedural, it could be a very significant obstacle to Governor McAuliffe. And it's quite clear that the Republicans, now having been reduced to a legislative party, are very much in a defensive stance. And the affirmation of this protocol, I suspect, is only going to underscore that.
Yeah, you should never underestimate the legislative desire to remind a governor about legislative protocol and legislative, preferences and privileges, that no matter how much he may be governor, he's still got to get stuff through a Republican House of Delegates, and I think this is probably intended as a little reminder of that.
And perhaps as well, to your point earlier about tensions within the Republican Party, that's certainly evident within the Republican caucus in the House, though it's certainly more conservative than it has been. But I'm wondering if this emphasis on control is fashioned with that in mind as well, to just kind of keep everybody in the foxhole together.
Maybe.
And discourage freelancing, if you will.
It shall be interesting. It shall. I suppose Governor McDonnell probably had members of his party introduce his budget amendments, because I don't recall any big brouhaha 4 years ago. Like you say, he was aware of the process, and so Republicans, particularly on appropriations or on Senate Finance, probably put his amendments in under their names. And so I suppose it'll be something similar to that.
And the budget 4 years ago, let's recall, was an outgoing Democratic governor, Tim Kaine, and it was filled with two things that Republicans, including the incoming governor, then Bob McDonnell, were opposed to, which was car tax swap for a new income tax. So there was more unanimity on the Republican side that that plan wasn't going to fly.
The other thing, keep in mind that a governor has a nuclear weapon. It's called the veto. Mm-hmm. And so that's something that any governor, Democrat or Republican, can use somewhat artfully, sometimes less than artfully. The Senate is essentially assuming a 2020 Senate with a Democratic lieutenant governor casting the tiebreaker, and there are limits to what a lieutenant governor can do on budget votes. But that is an insurance policy for Terry McAuliffe. It means that his vetoes could be affirmed very easily with that even split in the Senate, as opposed to the 27 votes that one party would have to muster to overturn a gubernatorial veto.
Mm-hmm. What you're talking about, what you hear about on some matters. What are you hearing about what could occur in the Senate, assuming for the moment after these two special elections, it is 2020 with Democrat lieutenant governor? Are you sensing that there's tension that could erupt in the Senate, or are you hearing that they're working things out? And I'll preface my remarks by saying that I think that probably the vast majority of Virginians, if they had an opinion, would say people ought to be working together for the good of the entire Commonwealth instead of fights. But having teed it up that way, what do you project, or what are you possibly hearing about what could occur in the Senate?
Well, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think to Jeff's point earlier about some movement perhaps with committee chairmanships and things of that sort in the Senate, one of the things I've heard is just this notion that if Democrats do regain control of the chamber, that current Senate Democratic leader, Minority Leader Dick Saslaw would look to not to resume his place atop Commerce and Trade that he once had, but would presumably go to the Education and Health Committee, which is where some of these kind of social pieces of legislation, abortion-related bills come through, with a mind on Democrats, I think, believe that, you know, the kind of war on women slogan that they coined in previous election cycles, that they believe worked well for them, that they can perhaps capitalize on that again, try to bring up pieces of legislation either to undo things that Republicans have done to restrict abortion rights in recent years, or to perhaps expand abortion rights in some fashion as well, and use those fights, even if they are only going to die either in the Senate or more likely in the House if they escape the Senate, to use those fights to say, look at what the Republicans are doing, you know, part of this ongoing war on women as they characterize it.
Well, I was going to say was sort of a more broad version of that was that I had heard talk about, you know, if it wound up being a 2020 Senate with Ralph Northam as Lieutenant Governor, so it would be a Democratic Senate, that you might wind up with Democratic chairmen of committees with still Republican majorities on those committees. That, you know, it's a lot of complicated procedural stuff, and I think nobody really knows exactly what's going to happen until we get both of these special elections done. So.
Dick Saslaw indicated in a video that turned up on a Democratic blog over the weekend that he was prepared to use his votes with a lieutenant governor of his party breaking the tie to turn things around in the Senate. There are lots of procedural tricks that are available to the members of the Senate, one of which is rarely seen. I think I've seen a motion once, an attempt once in the Senate to discharge the committee. That is holding a bill. It's a highfalutin way of saying, let's take the bill out of the committee, bring it directly to the floor, and have the entire Senate consider the bill. This is another option that the Democrats discuss. For months now, both parties have been going over the rules, trying to figure out how much latitude they have. The defining rules have to do with the number of votes necessary to make changes specifically on chairmanships, and how that is done through what's known as the Committee on Committees, which is an entity, an unofficial, sort of murky entity that gets together and figures out who is who. So the Senate could be a real grab bag for a while, and lots of fun, and sort of house-like in terms of the level of chaos it's capable of achieving.
And maybe
Well, also remember, I mean, 2 years ago when the Senate organized in its current state, when it was a 2020 split, there were a lot of very bitter speeches made, especially on the Democratic side and some on the Republican side, about how that split had been, you know, dealt with procedurally and the division of power. And so I think it will be interesting to see, you know, if people remember their bitter statements this time around and how things actually play out. So.
And as well, within the Senate Republican caucus, there are divisions. There's also a generational element to that division. The more senior members tend to be, who are in the minority within the Republican caucus, tend to be more moderate, but they're in leadership. They depend on the kindness, if you will, of these of these younger, not necessarily loyal, but more aggressively conservative Republican senators.
And to both Jeff and Chelyen's point, a couple things to bear in mind. There may be an element of, if Democrats end up 2020, there may be an element of payback for what we saw with the lingering bitter feelings last year when Republicans sought to revisit redistricting 2 years later. There may be a little bit of element of payback there. And then the other point, as Chelyen talked about a few years ago when the rules were changed and Lieutenant Governor Bill Bolling, a Republican, was able to break the tie on the organization, Democrats went to court over that, and the court said, this is a political issue, effectively. We don't want any part of that. You could see the same thing develop this time around. Republicans try to go to court, and the courts say, no, thank you.
So it's going to be an interesting session, to say the least. And while our time is up, I really want to thank each of you for your reporting on a daily basis and for being on This Week in Richmond and helping to better inform our viewers. We look forward to having conversations with you as the session progresses. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This Week in Richmond is made possible in part by Dignity Memorial, caring for our communities with a network of funeral homes and cemeteries in Virginia and throughout North America. More information about Dignity Memorial's providers is online at dignitymemorial.com. Alpha Natural Resources, an energy company dedicated to respecting the land. Alpha Natural Resources, we power the world through the energy of our people. Haley Buick GMC, the place for a new Verano or Terrain Denali, in Richmond and online at haleybuickgmc.com. Everywhere there are lighting poles, there's one more opportunity to save money. Intelligent Illuminations provides cost-effective wireless lighting solutions for roadway or area outdoor lights. Kanawha Valley Arena, Virginia's cowboy town, hosting an array of events from Civil War reenactments to diesel truck pulls. More information online at virginiarodeo.com. The Virginia Chamber of Commerce, the voice of the Virginia business community, working in legislative, regulatory, and political arenas to promote the free enterprise system. So what do you do? Information about getting involved in advanced technology careers, making everything from clean energy to life-saving medicine, is available at dreamitdoitvirginia.com. Additional support is provided by these sponsors. And by the members of Virginia's public television stations. Thank you.